Hello out there, my name is Jay. I'm a teaching artist at the Rose Theater, and every Tuesday I'll be teaching this digital playwriting course. I'm very excited to have you here in our first installment, so without any further ado, let's get started on our first episode dealing with setting. Setting is essentially the where and the when that a story happens, and setting is very important to the way that we tell a story. For instance, a story that takes place in a volcano would be very different than a story that takes place in a Taco Bell drive-thru or in an elevator. A lot of the time, when I talk to people, especially young people, about setting in plays, they'll tell me that, hey Jay, plays happen on stage. Which is true, but there's a very important difference. While a play may happen on stage, the setting of a play is the world of the play. The where and the when of a play, where and when it happens. So for instance, in the Rose's production of Ella Enchanted, even though the play was happening on the Rose stage, the actual story was taking place in the Kingdom of Frel. So the Kingdom of Frel, over the course of Ella's life, was actually the setting of that play. Now, settings are very important to help create our story. In a sense, we do something called world building when we write plays. We're creating the world that our story exists in. But something that's very important to remember is that your setting is very, very important to every part of your work. Let's take a look at some examples of settings in pop culture so that we can pull from and understand why setting influences our story. Take, for example, the Pixar film Inside Out. In this film, we have two settings, that is, inside Riley's head and the human world. This works well because we're introduced to two storylines and how they interact with one another. The worlds aren't necessarily separated from one another, but they can still affect one another. In the scene where Riley is sitting at the dinner table with her parents, we see the manifested emotions changing the way that she is acting. So these two worlds can affect each other, even though we have two different places that we go to over the course of the story. Another really great example is The Wizard of Oz. In The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy travels from one location to another when she gets to the land of Oz from Kansas. Something that's really important about Oz as a setting is the color that it has. It has these amazing colors in various places that help show the personality of the story, and this world that we know is different and weird to what we might usually see. The best example of this is probably found in the bright yellow brick road that's the centerpiece of the story. Dorothy follows the yellow brick road to go where she needs to be, as opposed to the roads of her time in her world in Kansas, which were mostly made out of dirt. By showing that difference, we understand that Dorothy's statement of not being in Kansas anymore makes a lot more sense. The last example that I want to talk about is Charlotte's Web. In the story of Charlotte's Web, we understand that we have characters who are animals and characters who are humans. But the difference is that setting plays a big part in understanding how those characters feel and their different ideas about the world. When we go inside the barn is when we understand how the animals are feeling. So the setting inside the barn helps us create the world that the animals live in, as opposed to the world that the humans live in when we go inside the house or we go to the county fair. With all of that being said, I'd like to share with you 4 tips on writing a good setting for your play. Tip number 1 is use detail. The more detail that you use in your story, the better we can understand the play and the world that you're trying to create. Take, for example, the Harry Potter series. When we, as readers or watchers of the Cursed Child play or watchers of the films, go to the Hogwarts location, we see that Hogwarts has different rules and different ways of being. Hogwarts has its own secret passageways, its own code of conduct. Hogwarts has its own way that food appears at the Great Hall. By having all these little details to help create the setting, Hogwarts as a place feels more alive, as opposed to something where we just didn't know all of these details. Tip number 2 is to learn from others. Something that's really important to recognize is that the more you write, the more you should actually read. This is very important, especially based on the setting of your play. If you're writing a play that takes place in, for example, a 1950s high school, then it would be a really good thing for you to do to read other plays or other stories or other pieces of media that have a 1950s high school. Maybe the musicals Grease or Bye Bye Birdie would be a really great place to start to understand how people understand a 1950s high school. Tip number 3 is to use all 5 senses when you're creating your setting. Something that's very different about plays as opposed to movies or TV shows is that when you're sitting in the audience for a play, you can smell it. If a character is on stage cooking bacon, then the audience should be able to smell it. Because of that, even if not all of the senses work its way into the script of your story, it's really important to recognize, and for you as a playwright to understand, what does this world smell like? What does it sound like? Not only what does it look like. Tip number 4 is to make sure that the setting is important to the plot. In many ways, a good story shouldn't happen just anywhere. A lot of us, when we're writing, have this idea that we want our plays to connect with anyone who can read them, which is totally fine and is a totally real thing to think. But the connections come from the characters, not necessarily the place that we are in. This goes back to the idea of using detail and being specific. The more detail and more specificity that you have in creating your setting, the more that your setting is a legitimate place, and the more that your setting has an impact on the plot. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory needed to happen in a chocolate factory. All that being said, I actually have a writing prompt for those of you at home to help you begin developing a setting. Choose one of the following 3 options and describe that setting using all 5 senses. Your 3 options are an aisle in a grocery store, the bottom of the ocean, and the inside of a car. Choose one of those 3 and describe that setting using all 5 of your senses. So those are sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste. A really fun tip is, after you do this writing, is to give your writing to someone else that you trust. Have that person draw a picture of the setting that you've described and see if it matches up with what you've written. If you do have someone make that, please take a picture of it and be sure to tag the Rose's social media so that we can see how people have been working with our playwriting class. Thank you for joining me for the Rose's first digital playwriting class. I'm very excited to continue this project, and I really hope to have you see our video next week where we talk about plot. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them in the next video. Thank you for watching, and have a good rest of your day.